A boot kicked the great oak doors open so hard they cracked against the stone. Plates jumped on the tables. A goblet tipped and spilled red wine across white linen. Servants froze mid-step, trays trembling in their hands. Somewhere a child began to cry and was quickly hushed. At the head of the hall, in the tall carved chair meant for a queen, a thin girl sat rigid, her fingers white on the armrests. A half-blind dog pressed against her ankles and growled low. Boots came down the aisle, one heavy step after another, and the whole court held its collective breath. Then the tall man in black stopped, and his voice tore through the room. "Get up." Her name was Alara Voss, and she was about to lose everything or gain it. What made a warrior king's voice crack on that single word? Stay with me on this one. Now let me take you back an hour, because none of this makes sense unless you understand how a servant ended up in a queen's chair. Ironhold Keep sat high in the mountains, above the tree line where the snow never fully melted. A fortress carved into gray rock, and inside its walls lived the Vane Pack, the strongest wolf pack in the northern reaches. And at the very bottom of that pack, below the guards, below the kitchen boys, below even the men who shoveled the kennels, lived Alara. She was an Omega. In that world, that already meant something. Omegas were rare, supposed to be precious, protected, prized. But Alara had no family to protect her. Her parents had died in a fever season when she was small, and no one had ever come to claim her. So she grew up in the servants' quarters, sleeping on straw, wearing whatever the kitchen mistress handed down, learning fast that the safest thing an orphan Omega could do was stay invisible. She was good at it. She scrubbed pots until her hands cracked in the cold. She hauled water up 4 flights of frozen stairs. And she never, ever asked for anything. The one thing that was hers, the only thing, was a dog, Bramble. A big gray wolfhound, gone half-blind and gray around the muzzle, with a bad hip that made him drag one back leg. Years ago, the master of hounds had ordered him drowned, said he was too old to hunt and too costly to feed. Alara had hidden him in the wood store for 3 weeks, feeding him scraps from her own plate. When they found out, they beat her for it. But they let the dog live, mostly because they thought it was funny, the useless Omega and her useless dog. Bramble followed her everywhere. He slept across her feet at night, and when the other servants pinched her or spat in her food, that old dog would lift his lip and growl, and they would back off, because even a half-blind wolfhound has teeth. That was Alara's whole life, until the night of the feast. Here's the thing you need to understand. The Alpha King, Rurk Vane, was getting married. Or he was supposed to be. A great alliance had been arranged with a southern pack, and their finest Omega, a girl named Seraphine, was traveling north to be his queen. The whole keep had spent a month preparing. They scrubbed every stone. They roasted a dozen deer whole. They strung the great hall with silver and pine. The king himself, though, nobody had seen for days. He'd ridden out into the storm on some errand of his own and had not come back. That should have been the first sign something was wrong. But the steward pressed on because a betrothal feast waits for no one, not even the groom. So the night came. The hall filled with lords and ladies in their finest. The tables groaned with food, and everyone waited for the bride to arrive. She didn't. An hour passed. The candles burned down. The lords began to mutter. The southern escort was hours late, and out in that weather, late could mean dead in a snowdrift. And an empty queen's chair at a betrothal feast, with 200 guests staring at it, that was more than an embarrassment. In pack law, an empty seat at a joining was an ill omen. It meant the union was cursed before it began. The steward, a thin, nervous man named Corvin, was sweating through his good coat. He kept glancing at that empty chair like it was a snake about to bite him. And then he had an idea, a terrible, cowardly idea. He grabbed the nearest servant girl by the arm. That was Alara. She'd been sent up to refill the wine jugs, keeping to the shadows along the wall, invisible as always. Bramble limped at her heel. "You," Corvin hissed, "You're an Omega, you'll do, sit in the chair." She thought she'd misheard him. "Sir." "The Queen's chair, sit in it. Just until the bride comes. We can't have it empty, the lords are already talking. Put on the veil, sit still, and no one will know the difference from a distance." "Sir, I can't. If anyone sees me, they'll whip me." "They'll do worse." His grip tightened until it hurt. "You'll be whipped right now if you don't. You sit until she arrives, then slip out the back and no one is any the wiser. Do it, girl, or I'll have the skin off your back tonight and throw your mangy dog off the wall while you watch." And that right there was the choice. Get whipped now for sure, or maybe get whipped later. When you have nothing and someone threatens the one thing you love, you don't have much of a choice at all. So Alara let him drag her up onto the dais. He threw a silver veil over her hair, pushed her down into the Queen's chair, and hissed at her to keep her eyes down. Then he scurried away to deal with the guests. And there she was. An orphan servant in a queen's chair, praying the real bride would walk through those doors before the king came home. Bramble climbed the steps behind her, slow and stiff, and curled up over her feet. She put one trembling hand down and buried her fingers in his fur and held on because it was the only warm thing in that whole cold hall. The lords settled. The talking died down. From a distance, in the flickering light with the veil over her face, they must have thought the bride had quietly arrived after all. The music started again. For one strange, suspended moment, it almost worked. Then the doors blew open and the king came home. Now understand what everyone in that hall believed in the next few seconds. They believed the Alpha King had returned from his storm, seen a serving girl in rags under a stolen veil, sitting in his queen's chair. They believed he'd drag her out by the hair and make an example of her no servant would ever forget. That was the story every single person there was telling themselves as those boots came down the aisle. Alara believed it too. She didn't run. There was nowhere to run. She just gripped the armrests and shut her eyes and waited for the blow. The blow didn't come. Rourke Vane stopped 3 feet from the dais. He was a big man, mountain big, with a black beard and a scar through one eyebrow and shoulders that filled a doorway. Snow was still melting on him. His eyes, when they found her, were already burning at the insult of it. He filled his lungs to roar her out of that chair and into the snow. "Get up." The whole hall flinched, and then something happened that no one expected. The king went still. His nostrils flared. He'd caught a scent on the air coming off that trembling girl, and it stopped him mid-breath like a spear to the chest, because he knew that scent. He'd spent 13 years chasing it. He'd smelled it once before, long ago, in a nursery full of blood and smoke. The night raiders came over the wall and stole a pup from her cradle. His pup. The Omega girl born the same winter as him, promised to him by the old right of the pack, marked as his true mate. He was 6 years old the night she was taken. He'd held on to one thing all those years, the smell of her soaked into the blanket left behind in the empty crib. He'd kept that blanket. He'd memorized it. He'd built a whole life around the promise that he would find it again. And here it was, filling his lungs, coming off a starving servant girl in a stolen veil. His voice cracked wide open on the second word, and it came out not as a command but as something torn. "Get up." Alara opened her eyes. The king was staring at her like a man who'd seen a ghost. His hand was half raised, shaking. The fury was gone and something else was there instead, something raw and disbelieving. And the whole court saw it and did not understand it and went dead silent trying to. Alara did the only thing she knew how to do. She dropped to her knees on the stone, pulling the veil off, baring her throat the way a servant bares her throat when she expects to be struck. "Forgive me, my king," she whispered. "The steward made me sit. I didn't want to. Please don't hurt my dog. Punish me, not him. It was me." And Bramble, that old half-blind wolfhound, hauled himself up on his bad hip, planted himself between the girl and the king, and growled at the most powerful man in the north like he was nothing but a wolf at the door. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Rurk Vane, Alpha King of Ironhold, went down, not on her, down, onto one knee at the foot of his own dais in front of 200 of his lords and brought his face level with hers. "Say your name," he said. His voice was barely a whisper now. "Say your name, girl." "Ilara, my king, Ilara Voss." "Voss?" He shook his head slowly. "No, that's the name they gave you. Who were your parents?" "I don't know, my king. They died when I was little. I never had a name but the one the kitchen gave me." "How old are you?" She didn't understand the question, but she answered it. 19 winters, maybe 20. Something moved through his face when she said it, something that looked almost like pain. "Roll up your sleeve," he said. "Your left arm, the inside of the wrist, show me." Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely do it, but she pushed the ragged sleeve up her thin arm and turned her wrist to the light. And there, faded and old, half hidden under years of dirt and scars, was a mark. A pale birthmark shaped like a crescent moon, the kind the servants had always mocked her for, calling it the devil's thumbprint. The king made a sound like he'd been punched. "If you're still with me and you want to see how this ends, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Because what the king said next changed everything, and you are going to want to be here for it." Rurk reached out slowly, the way you'd reach for something that might vanish, and touched 2 fingers to that crescent mark. His huge hand was trembling. "I have looked for this mark for 13 years, he said. His voice was rising, filling the hall, shaking with something the court had never heard from him. "The night the Ashbourne raiders came over the north wall, they killed my nurse. They killed 2 of my father's guards. And they took the child from the cradle beside mine, an Omega girl, born the same winter I was, promised to me by bloodright before either of us could walk, my true mate. They took her and left nothing behind but a blanket and a smell I have never forgotten." He turned his head and looked out at the silent lords. "They told me she was dead. My whole life they told me she died in the snow that night. I mourned her for 13 years. I have refused every match my council put in front of me because none of them ever smelled like the truth." He turned back to Ilara, and the fury came back into his voice, but now she understood it was not aimed at her. "And now I come home from burying an empty grave and I find her scrubbing my floors, in rags, half-starved, sitting in the very chair she was born to sit in, terrified I was going to have her whipped for it." The hall had stopped breathing entirely. Ilara stared at him. Her whole life she'd been nothing, less than nothing. And now this mountain of a man was kneeling on the stone in front of her, telling her she was the one thing he'd been searching for since he was a boy. "My king," she managed, "there must be a mistake. I cleaned the pots. I couldn't be. You have her mark, you have her scent, you have her age." He said each word like a stone dropped into deep water. "There is no mistake. I would know your scent in a burning building with my eyes gone." He swallowed hard. "The gods have a cruel sense of humor. My true mate has been living in my own walls for years, and every year I let them treat her like a dog." At the word dog, Bramble lowered his hackles a little as if he decided the big man might not be a threat after all. The old hound leaned against Ilara's side and she wrapped her arm around him because she needed something to hold. That should have been the end of it. Kingdom found its lost queen, wrong made right, everyone weeps, roll the music. That's how the story wants to go. But real halls are full of real people, and some of those people had a great deal to lose if that servant girl turned out to be the true queen. Rurk rose to his feet. He turned to the steward, Corvin, who had gone the color of old cheese. "You put her in that chair," the king said. My king, I meant no. The seat was empty, the omen, I only meant two. For once in your worthless life, you did something right. The king's mouth twisted. Get up off your knees, and someone bring my mate a chair beside my own and food and a cloak. She is freezing. And here is where the false calm broke. A voice cut across the hall, cold, smooth, and completely unbothered. That won't be necessary. Everyone turned. Down the center aisle came a woman in a traveling cloak of white fox fur, flanked by 6 armed men in southern colors. She was beautiful the way a blade is beautiful. She pulled back her hood and smiled at the king, as though the last 5 minutes had simply not occurred. "Forgive our lateness, Alpha King," she said, sweeping into a shallow bow. "The storm delayed us on the pass. I am Seraphine of House Dane, your bride." Her eyes flicked to Alara, kneeling in rags, and her smile sharpened. "I see your servants have been keeping my chair warm. How thoughtful. You can send this one back to the kitchens now. I'll be sitting there." And just like that, the whole nature of the thing changed. Because this was no longer about a lost pup and a happy ending. There was a signed alliance on the table now. A binding contract between 2 packs, sealed in blood and gold, promising the Alpha King's hand to Seraphine of House Dane. Break that contract and the South would call it an insult worth a war. Alara was no longer just a found daughter. She was an obstacle standing between 2 nations and peace. And Seraphine had 6 armed men, a mountain of southern gold behind her, and 13 years of the king's grief working in her favor, because the whole court still half believed the girl in rags was some servant's trick. Rourke stepped between the 2 women. "The contract was for my true mate. This girl is my true mate. The contract is satisfied by her, not you." Seraphine laughed, light and easy. "Is it? A scent, a birthmark, a sad story told over a girl who spent her whole life dreaming of exactly this. My king, grief makes fools of stronger men than you." She turned to the lords now. "My lords, you know the law. A true mate claim can be challenged. And when a servant with nothing suddenly claims to be a lost princess the very night a real bride is late, it must be challenged. I invoke the trial of blood and scent. Let the old ways decide, not one lonely man's broken heart." A murmur ran through the hall, and it was not on Alara's side. Half of them wanted the alliance. Half simply could not believe the pot scrubber was anything but a liar. And the law was the law. The king's jaw clenched. "You would put her through a trial." "I would put your kingdom before your sentiment," Seraphine said sweetly. "If she is what you say, she has nothing to fear. If she is a liar, we will all be glad we found out before you put a crown on a scullery maid." And there it was, the trap closing. Because Seraphine of House Dane knew one thing no one else in that hall knew. She knew what had happened on the North Wall 13 years ago. She knew because her own father had paid the Ashbourne raiders to do it. The plan had always been to remove the true mate and put a Dane girl in the empty seat. They'd failed to kill the child, that was true. But they'd made sure she vanished so completely that no one would ever connect a nameless kitchen orphan to a stolen princess. And now, standing 3 feet from the very girl her family had tried to erase, Seraphine had no intention of letting the truth crawl up out of the ashes. She needed Alara to fail that trial. And if the trial didn't finish the girl, a knife in the dark would. Alara understood none of the politics. But she understood the woman's eyes. She'd seen eyes like that her whole life, in the faces of people who'd already decided to hurt her. So she pushed herself up off the floor, still holding Bramble's collar, and she stood. "I'll do your trial," she said. Her voice shook, but she said it. "I don't want a crown. I never asked for any of this. But I won't stand here and be called a liar for something I never even claimed. If the old ways will say what's true, then let them say it." Rourke looked at her, and for the first time, something like pride crossed his ruined face. "Then the trial is set," Seraphine said, "at dawn, and when your servant fails, my king, you will honor the contract you signed." She swept back down the aisle, her men closing around her, already sure she had won. The trial of blood and scent was an old rite, older than the keep itself. The claimant was given the relic of the lost one, the object that carried their birth scent. In this case, the blanket from the empty cradle which the king had kept locked away for 13 years. The claimant held it through the night, and at dawn, before the assembled pack, an alpha of pure blood, blindfolded, would scent the claimant and the relic in turn and swear whether they were one and the same. If the scents matched, the claim was true. If not, the claimant was a proven liar, and the punishment for false claiming a royal bond was death. Death. That was the stakes now. Not a whipping, not the snow. If she lost, they would kill her, and Seraphine had thought of everything. She sent one of her men to bribe the master of hounds, and by midnight a plan was in motion. They would not risk the trial at all. Before dawn, while the girl slept, a man would go into the servants' quarters and cut her throat, and they'd say she had run rather than face the right, which everyone would take as proof of her guilt anyway. But here is the thing about Seraphine's plan. It had one flaw, and that flaw had a bad hip and gray around the muzzle. They came in the small hours, two of them quiet as smoke. Alara was asleep on her straw, exhausted, the king's old blanket clutched to her chest. She didn't hear them. She didn't wake. Bramble did. The old hound could barely see. But his nose still worked, and his ears still worked, and he'd spent 13 years learning that when strange men came in the dark, it meant harm to the only person who'd ever loved him. He came up off the floor with a roar that filled the whole quarter and hit the first man chest high, all his old weight behind it, and drove him into the wall. The knife went spinning. The second man swore and slashed at the dog, and Bramble caught the blade across the shoulder and did not let go, and he screamed. This sound of an old dog fighting for the last thing that mattered, and it woke the whole keep. Guards came running. Alara came awake to blood and shouting, and her dog's teeth locked in a stranger's arm. The would-be killers ran, but not before a dozen men saw their faces and saw the southern colors under their cloaks, and that changed everything all over again. Because now Seraphine of House Dane had a problem. Two of her men had just been caught, weapons drawn, standing over the girl she'd sworn was a harmless liar. If the girl was nothing, why send assassins? The lords who doubted Alara started asking that question out loud, and Seraphine had no good answer. Bramble lay in the straw with a long cut down his shoulder, bleeding into the dirt, his breath coming ragged. Alara knelt over him, pressing her hands to the wound, sobbing, begging him to hold on. And that was how the king found her when he burst in with his sword drawn, ready to kill anyone in the room. He took it all in at once. The blood. The southern captives held against the wall. The old dog dying to save his mate. And the girl he'd searched 13 years for, weeping over the only creature that had ever protected her. "Bring the keep's own healer," Rourke said, in a voice that left no room for anything but obedience. "For the dog, now." Someone gasped. A healer for a servant's dog. But no one dared argue with the king's face. They saved Bramble. The healer stitched the shoulder and packed the wound and said the old hound was tougher than he had any right to be. Alara stayed by his side the rest of that night, her hands red, refusing to leave, and the king stayed with her, and neither of them slept. And somewhere in those dark hours, kneeling in the straw beside a wounded dog, the Alpha King and his lost mate finally, quietly, began to talk to each other like two people instead of a king and a servant. Dawn came anyway, and the trial went ahead because Seraphine, cornered and furious, demanded it, still gambling that the old right would clear her. She'd convinced herself the assassins could be blamed on overzealous guards, and that the girl would still fail the scenting. Her family had gone to enormous trouble to bury this secret. She would not let it out of the grave without a fight. The whole pack gathered in the great hall at first light. Alara stood at the center, pale and shaking, holding the old blanket. Bramble lay at her feet, bandaged, refusing to be left behind, dragging himself into the hall on 3 legs to be near her. Seraphine stood across from her in her white furs, chin high. The blindfolded elder came forward. He was the oldest pure-blood alpha in the north, blind already from age, which was why he was chosen, a man who judged only by scent and had no eyes to be swayed by rags or fur. He took the blanket first and pressed it to his face and breathed the 13-year-old scent of a stolen child deep into his lungs. He held it a long time. Then he set it down and shuffled toward Alara. The hall was so quiet you could hear the fire. The old man leaned close to her throat and breathed in. Once. Twice. A third time, slow and deep, and then the blind elder began to weep. "It is her," he said, and his old voice broke on it, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "By the blood in my nose and the truth in the old ways, this is the child from the cradle. This is the true mate of the king. There is no doubt, none. Her scent and the relic are one and the same." He turned his blind face toward the crowd. "I held this pup the night she was born. I blessed her myself, and I have grieved her 13 years. This is her. The lost one has come home." The hall erupted, and Seraphine's face finally cracked. She looked around at the roaring pack, at the lords now turned against her, at the king staring at her with a slow, terrible understanding, and she made one last mistake. She reached for the knife at her own belt and lunged at Alara, screaming that a scullery maid would never wear her crown. She never reached her. Bramble, who could barely stand, who was stitched and bandaged and should not have been able to move at all, launched off his 3 good legs one final time and put himself between the blade and his girl. And the king's sword was already moving. Seraphine of House Dane went down at the foot of the dais, her white furs going red, and the truth of what her family had done 13 years ago spilled out of her men under questioning before the sun was fully up. The raid, the gold, the plan to erase a princess and sell a Dane girl into her place, all of it. The alliance was not broken by the king. It was broken by the South's own treachery, and no one, not even the Southern lords, could call it anything but justice. So let me bring you back to where we started. A servant in a queen's chair, a dog at her feet, a king shouting, "Get up." And now you know why his voice cracked. It wasn't rage. It was 13 years of grief coming loose all at once, at the exact moment he stopped looking and finally, impossibly, found. They did not rush the wedding. That's the part I like best, honestly. Rourke Vane could have put a crown on Alara's head that same day and called it settled. He didn't. He knew what it was to be told what you are by people with power over you, and he refused to do that to her. Instead, he moved her out of the servants' quarters and gave her rooms of her own and food and warmth and time. He let her decide. And Alara, who'd spent her whole life being invisible, slowly learned how to be seen. It didn't happen overnight. For weeks she still flinched when doors opened. She still tried to carry her own plates to the kitchen out of habit, and the cooks who used to spit in her food now didn't know where to look. She was gentle with them anyway. That was the thing about her that even the king hadn't expected. She had every right to be hard, and she chose, over and over, to be kind. She pardoned the steward who'd shoved her into that chair. She even pardoned the master of hounds who'd once ordered her dog drowned, on the single condition that no old or crippled animal in that keep would ever be put down for being old or crippled again. He agreed. What else could he do? Bramble healed slow, but he healed. He got a bed by the great fire, the warmest spot in the whole keep, and he took to it like he'd been born to it. The lords who'd once laughed at the Omega, and her useless dog now stepped carefully around a wolfhound who had twice thrown himself onto a blade for the woman who would be their queen. Nobody called him useless anymore. When the wedding finally did come, Months later in the spring, when the snow was melting off the low passes, Alara walked to that same chair on her own 2 feet. No steward dragged her. No veil hid her face. She sat down in the queen's seat because it was hers, and this time the hall did not gasp, it cheered, and the sound of it went out over the mountains. Bramble climbed the dais steps, slow and stiff, and curled up over her feet the way he always had. She reached down and buried her fingers in his gray fur, the same as she'd done that first terrible night, except now her hand did not shake. And Rurk, the Alpha King who had searched 13 years for a scent on an old blanket, put his hand over hers, and the 3 of them sat together at the head of the hall, the king, the lost girl, and the half-blind dog who had guarded her through all of it. Here's what I keep coming back to. Everyone in that hall that first night was so sure they knew the story. Servant in a stolen seat, about to be thrown into the snow. They had it completely backward. The lowest person in that whole keep turned out to be the highest. The girl they treated like a dog was a queen, and the dog they'd tried to drown turned out to be worth more than every armed man in the South. The world had told Alara Voss exactly what she was worth her whole life. It was wrong. And the night it finally found out how wrong it was, it happened in front of everyone in a great cold hall with a king on his knees and an old dog standing guard. That's the story. Take from it what you want. But the next time you see someone the world has decided is nothing, someone in the corner keeping their head down, holding onto the one small thing that loves them, remember Alara in that chair. You never know who's really sitting there, and neither did they. That lands at roughly 4,990 words, inside the 4,805,200 window. The hook is untouched at 150 words, and every beat survives. The falscom break at Seraphine's entrance, the CTA after the birthmark reveal, the assassination attempt, the trial, the payoff, and the full resolution. The cuts came almost entirely from trimming doubled phrasing and redundant sensory lines in the setup and middle stretches.